panel Q&A. So this gives us all a chance. If you have questions for the panelists, you can either put them in the chat, or if you would like to unmute and ask, it gives a chance. All the material and information you've gotten so far, if there's any questions or any thoughts that come to mind. I actually have a question. Oh, Joyce, go ahead.
All right. Well, Brian, I have a question for you. You mentioned blogs and you mentioned podcasts, and I know that there is Pathway Project for blogs, or there used to be. I know there's a Pathway Project for podcasts, but I haven't seen a blog in a long time. Maybe you could help me with what would you consider a definition of the two, and which do you prefer? Probably the podcast, huh?
Probably the podcast. Yeah, definition of the two. I mean, this is Brian Wilburn paraphrasing it, but I mean, a blog is a written, it's a written communication, a written medium of communicating your message, essentially. So one of the popular sites for that is like WordPress. And so you go on WordPress and you create a blog. And so it's something that you can upload text that you can do it daily, hourly, weekly, however you want to communicate that message. It's a written form. And then podcast is really an audio form of communication. It can also be a video form, though. There can be, like our first speaker was saying, a video podcast. That's actually one of the fastest growing things, is to create a video podcast. I probably, missed the mark by not doing video, but I just don't want people looking at me. I'm usually drinking a beer when I'm podcasting. I don't need them seeing me sipping that. So, audio, yeah, that's basically it, and honestly, when you look at where people consume them, it's still largely in audio formats in Spotify and in Apple. So that would be the big distinguisher, Joyce.
Could I take on to that?
Please do.
From a web developer perspective.
No, James, I've said all there is to be said. So no, you can't.
Overruled. From a web developer's perspective, the technical distinction is the linguistic history of both of them is fascinating, but I will not get into that as a whole. I'll save that for a Nerdmasters night on etymologies, which might be in our future. Who knows? But a blog is just simply something that's updated regularly on the internet. So technically speaking, you could say a podcast is a subcategory of a blog. And you could also look at a podcast, like I said, it can be video as well as audio. And so you couldn't really say, though, that a blog is a podcast. All Labradors are dogs, but not all dogs are Labradors. But what you can do, like Kayla was saying, was that you can take a video recording of your interview, take the audio of it, push it to the podcast platforms, and some of those support video now as well, so you can send the video as well. You can take the video, send it to YouTube. You can transcribe that, clean it up, and post that as a blog post. And then you can also take snippets of that and reformat it and make that a blog as well. Right? So you get all forms of content from one interview. That's what I do. The nice thing about that is that so far, Google doesn't listen to podcasts for search engine optimization. It does read, though. Right? So if you have the transcript that's cleaned up and nicely structured from your podcast, and you post that with your podcast on your site, like I had with my link I put in there for my business one, you can put the information on there. And I'm working on getting the transcriptions cleaned and put on there as well, so that all of those keywords from the discussion organically will show up in SEO, and you'll get higher ratings for your website. So podcast, blog, video, yes. The answer is yes.
All right, we do have a question here in the chat. There's been some elaboration in the chat from Kay, but I'd be happy to hear if anyone else has any suggestions. What do you recommend when you're recording interviews remotely and you want to get good video and audio?
I guess I could take it. Yeah. So most of my interviews are remote. So I've experimented with different platforms. The ones I listed there were Zencaster or Squadcast. There's also Riverside FM. Those are all great recording, and you can get transcripts downloaded from those too. And then actually what you guys see me on is that looks a little bit like Alien. It is my microphone, the Blue Snowball. And I got it on Amazon, and it's been my main podcasting mic for remote. And I usually send out some housekeeping notes to my guests and let them know, hey, if you have some Apple earbuds or a microphone or something, or you're in a quiet place, to help them get the best audio on their side too. And they're usually pretty good about responding well to that. So those are my tips and tricks.
And typically you
Thanks,
can
Kay.
get better quality with a dedicated platform for podcasting interviews and whatnot. If you're not as comfortable with waiting as far afield, Zoom does work in a pinch too. So something that's more people are more familiar with that and integrates with more things. So Zoom also works. Oh, Robin uses Descript. I have wanted to play with Descript. It looks like magic, and I like magic.
I'm just diving in, and it's incredible. Like you can even remove, like you can take your transcript and you can remove ums and ahs or like long pauses just from deleting the words. Like
In
you
the
can
text.
delete words, or you can like,
And it modifies the audio, yeah.
yeah, it's, and you, I think you can add, I don't quote me. I haven't played enough, but I think you can.
When I was looking at the site, if you have, I think it might be restricted to the pro version or something like that. But yeah, you can teach it your voice,
Yep.
and you can type words to correct from one word to another, and it'll actually simulate your voice to replace your words in there to make it work.
Totally. You can practically write an audiobook, you guys. It's
Yeah. With your voice.
Yep.
AI is amazing.
Does anyone else have any questions or anything they want to bring up now?
You have plenty of time.
Sherry?
I was wondering about the frequency of the podcasts. If you've done any kind of experiments as far as how often you should do them, and you change that up. And so I just like to hear from each of you about that.
How about if each of us answer that one? Because the experience is different for each audience. I do a different frequency for both my professional and my fun one. The one that we are deliberately making non-professional, because otherwise it would stress us out. We have too much fun to make it professional. The non-professional one we do on a monthly basis for the most part. Over this summer, both of us got really super busy. And so what we ended up doing was what we called summer ramblings, where we just meet up weekly. We record with no prep time whatsoever, us rambling on random stuff. And then we just like post it whenever it gets edited. So it's been all over the place. And we let people know, like, this is going to be random and crazy. Don't shoot us. And then we'll get back to something regular after the summer. So we just started getting back into the regular routine, which is a little bit more heavy, where we have like 2 or 3 hours prep time to talk, and then we do a couple hours or 3 hours recording, just talking nonstop. And so that is a lot more work to fit in to get that in. So with my professional one, I have a whole workflow for it. Kayla's done this with me, where you say, hey, I want you to be on my podcast. I send her a link with Calendly. She books an hour. I spend the entire 10, 15 minutes talking about how you want to hit. We record for 35 to 45 minutes. I take it off at the end. I run through my post-processing, and I can schedule and have it out in another half hour. So I have a really down quick for exactly the process that I use. So I can keep up to date. I make it as part of my networking routine. I meet somebody, I want to connect with them more, I invite them on my podcast. So they're doing me a favor, they're doing them a favor, and it creates a better networking connection, which builds my business. Even if nobody actually listens to the episode, it's still helping create connections more effectively. And so I have it as part of that routine. So I'm always having new guests. and I'm typically ahead of the game and schedule things out further that way. So I'm always ahead of it. So I can actually afford to do that one twice a month. So I do that first and third Fridays typically. So it depends on the podcast, depends on who you're interviewing, how frequently you can find people to interview, and then how quickly you can edit them and get them out the door, and then how much prep time and how much time you have to do that prep time and the recording and the post-processing and all of that. But the general rule of thumb, as frequently as you can manage without killing yourself, is kind of the rule of thumb that I've gone by.
Kayla, I was going to give you like ladies first if you wanted to jump in on anything.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I right now I'm producing weekly, and that's been a good rhythm for me because it keeps me accountable for not only getting my podcast out there, but also creating content around it, like the blog posts and updating my website. So that's been a really good accountability tool, as well as I think it just creates consistency. I do occasionally break. When I was in the middle of a couple of seasons, I think it was like a 4-month break, but I was also living in an RV, and I was kind of in a different time of my life, but it was fun to take that break and come back with like a new perspective. But yeah, I produce weekly. And I mean, I think it's like, as long as you're consistent, like if you're doing it for professionally, if you're consistent, like even bi-weekly works, or if you want to do interview style and then maybe the next week do monologue or recap and then go into another one as well. But yeah, I think experiment and have fun. Don't forget to have fun, and don't let it run you. You run it, but creating consistency does help me stay on track.
Yeah, I would just dovetail on that. The things that I read on it, I mean, it's really as far as like your audience, and that's what you go back to, is like, it's about consistency. So like, think about what you listen to, and whether that's a radio program or a podcast. When it comes Tuesday at, it better be up, because that's when I, go to check and see if it's there. And if it's not, that's when people start to disengage with whatever you have, because they're looking for it. They want to like, oh, it's not there. And then maybe they think to go back to it later, or maybe they don't. But so really it's about whatever time you set, that's what you need to stay faithful to. And yeah, I post weekly. I think I had heard weekly or bi-weekly was a good time frame of reference, but it also depends on the length of your podcast. Bi-weekly might be good if your podcast length is like 45 minutes. Our podcast length is like 10 to 15 minutes. So every week, if you can't listen to 10 minutes, I mean, what are you doing with your life? So it's yeah, I mean, it's really that consistency. It's just like delivering what they want when they want, as far as your audience. So
could I pretend like somebody asked a question after that and bring up another topic to run through that I don't think many of us actually touched on? I'm kind of surprised. It's on episode link.
We have a question in the chat, so how about we address that first?
Sure.
And then you can have your
all right. We'll circle back to that one.
All right. So yes, the one in the chat here is, I produce an internal podcast for my company. The people I interview are people within the organization. We are looking to schedule interviews. How would you schedule them to fit in a one-a-day for podcast recording?
Wait, so Robin, could you clarify that? Are you looking to like record once a day, or are you looking to release once a day? Yeah, record a few interviews for a day. Scheduling, depending on how big your company is and how you manage your internal scheduling stuff, really depends on that. Like some companies are really locked into teams and whatnot. Are you releasing on a monthly basis? Okay. So you want to get ahead of it. Yeah, I wouldn't record for longer than a few hours at a time. Typically, like the one that I do monthly, sometimes breaks 3 hours long. And so we wouldn't do that weekly. That would be insane. Everybody get very tired of hearing us. My wife would shank me because she has to edit them. Too much listening to me. But if you're keeping them short and you're releasing on a monthly basis, but you're trying to record enough to stay ahead of the game. If you're releasing monthly, it really depends on how fast you can get them edited, I think. Because you could like record 2 a month, release once a month. That way, if you miss one or somebody reschedules or can't make it or something gets behind, you always have that margin. You don't want to get too far ahead of it because then you get really super out of sync. So someone says, "Hey, Merry Christmas," and it's June. By the time it gets released, that gets a bit awkward. So you don't want to get too far ahead. That gets awkward. But 2 to 1 is, I think, probably the most ahead of it that I would get. I don't know if that answers your question or not. That's just kind of my thoughts on scheduling for recording.
Is he talking about like software to use? Like,
Yeah,
like
if
I
you're
would
using software,
use,
it really depends on the company. Yeah.
yeah, like I mean, I just schedule it on Calendly
That's what I
usually.
use.
And I just
Calendly's
like, you can like schedule back to backs, but definitely give yourself that, some breathing room, because it's like, if you go from interview to interview to interview, they can get kind of lose that momentum because you're kind of like, it just gets to be a lot. But if you're recording, I would say give yourself a half hour in between or so, and then you just schedule them out on Calendly and then they can book through that.
I always advocate Calendly. And then Barry asked, did you have anything on that, Ryan, at all? Mhm.
Okay, I think that we are ready for the hypothetical question.
Hypothetical question. Then we can go to the tools for editing. All right. How long do you do your podcasts? Right. Which I kind of touched on that a little bit, depending on how much time it takes to prepare a podcast, goes into how long it's going to end up being, sometimes inversely. Like it's an apocryphal story that's attributed to half a dozen different people. I'm sorry I wrote you a long letter. I didn't have the time to write a short one. It's the more time you can prepare, the shorter and more concise you can get something. If you want to have a really good podcast, sorry, my cat is stargazing. If you want to have a really clean, crisp, short podcast, oftentimes what will happen is that people will send the interviewee the questions in advance so they can prepare them. And then they just go boom, boom, boom through them. And it's not really conversational. It's very clipped and like very terse, almost interrogatory. And sometimes that works. I like a more natural, organic feel where you discover things in the middle of the conversation that you hadn't planned. But you can also go too far with that and you end up with a really super long, rambly podcast with all the rabbit trails. And that just keeps going. And unless you are, an uber nerd where every rabbit trail is as fascinating as the previous one, and you have a ridiculously nerdy audience who loves every single rabbit trail better than the last one, that really is hard to sustain. Otherwise, people just get bored and don't want to listen to you anymore. I have podcasts to listen to like that. My favorite podcast is regularly over 3 hours, and it's just absolutely amazing and epic and nerdy. But yeah, that takes a lot of prep time, a lot of work, and a lot of expertise to be able to sustain that kind of content production. So finding a happy medium between that is nice just from a production standpoint. But then you also got to take into consideration your audience, like Brian is saying, always go back to the audience and look at what is their listening capacity. Are they listening on their commutes typically? How long is that commute typically? If you have a very specific niche, you might be able to actually narrow it down. Like, I'm only working for lawyers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and most of them live in this particular area and they commute to this area. And that's, I can look at the travel time on Google Maps and I need to make a podcast that's shorter than that, right? So you can go that precise if you really want to, if you know your audience that well. If you're talking with busy moms, maybe they want to listen to something longer, more rambly while they're washing dishes and doing laundry and whatnot, who knows? And so knowing your audience and what length they're going to appreciate best and then tailoring it to that, I think is the most important piece. And then building your production cycle around that. YouTube really likes 10 to 20 minute videos though, just saying. gives huge precedence to those ones.
Okay. All right. Well, now, so a question I have is I'm curious how you all like how do you find the inspiration for your episodes? Where do the ideas come from?
You go first, Brian. You haven't gone first yet.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I ask people for money and they say really weird things in response, and that feeds my things. Actually, it's funny. I feel like just with mine. So we talk about fundraising, and for me, I don't know if you guys operate that way, but I kind of almost have like a muse. I have someone in my life who looks at fundraising in such a weird, like erroneous way that I'm almost countering that person so much. In like, I'm like, even if this person won't listen to me, you out there, you listen and you do this the right way. So I feel like, I don't know, you find who your muse. For me, it's like, who's that muse of like, okay, or even just like, who's that person out there, like my prospective audience member that and where they're at in their journey. Maybe it's me 5-10 years ago, and how can I talk to them and like what they want to hear. But a lot of times I feel like for me, it's like reacting against, it's like, okay, I'm on a rant here. And I don't know, you guys have probably started a podcast like that, I'm sure. Like, I'm on a rant here. What the heck is up with this? And it's like, and then you go and you're like, and I'm sure everyone's like, shut your mouth. But anyway, that's how I think of it.
Yeah, soapboxes.
That is great. I've totally been there on the rant thing for sure. For me, it's like, I kind of go by law of attraction. It's, what we're kind of focused on, whatever your topic is, you'll start to find those people that resonate with that. And then it just organically happens. Sometimes I do, I try to get a warm lead into, like, if it's somebody I really want to interview, like more of a celebrity profile, something like that I really want to, like, I'm kind of more targeting, and you can do that. And it's always easier to have a warm lead than just a cold lead, but you can create warm leads if you're using your social media. I'm always trying to interact on different platforms, connecting with people, and especially ones that I feel like would be a really good fit. And then don't be afraid to make the ask. If you have a really killer interview with whoever, say, hey, do you know of anybody else who would resonate with this, who would want to be on their show or be on the show? And those are other ways I continue the momentum to find guests.
For myself, similarly to Kay, there's a lot of it that comes organically out of the relationships. If I connect, like click with somebody, like I did with Kay when we first met, we just like bouncing ideas and talking about all kinds of different things. We like, oh, you're just obviously a person that's gonna have a great podcast, because we just talked about 3 different topics in the space of 5 minutes that were really interesting, and we could have talked for another hour on each one of them. We just didn't have time now. So I want to make sure you have time to converse. Podcast is a good excuse. Let's make that happen. And so oftentimes it's an excuse to continue a conversation and to spark conversation with somebody that I find interesting. A tip for finding people who find interesting is to be interested in people. Be intentionally curious. Have structured curiosity. It's a skill. And as you're connecting with people, as you're talking to people, be intent in your listening so that you can connect on a deep level, discover what they're passionate about, find those things that click. When you are intentionally interested, there's a whole lot more interesting people in the world. It's funny how it works. And when you find interesting people, get them on your podcast.
Game over.